You are standing in the middle of a square. It is not large. You can see every face. They are not angry. They are not sad. They are just watching, the way people watch something they came to see. Your hands are bound behind your back. The rope is dry and it has already opened the skin at your wrists. Somewhere nearby, someone is selling bread. You can smell it. Life is continuing around you as if nothing unusual is happening. Because for everyone else here, nothing is. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing. Because without this, none of what follows makes any sense. The brutal punishments of history were not accidents. They were not the failures of civilization breaking down. They were civilization, functioning precisely as designed. Every empire that ever rose to power understood something that modern governments now understand in quieter, softer ways. Pain applied publicly and deliberately is cheaper than an army. Fear is infrastructure. Suffering is policy. You do not need to punish everyone if you punish one person correctly. So they built systems. They refined them across generations. They debated the right methods in legal councils and theological courts. They wrote manuals. They appointed specialists. They paid those specialists a salary. The executioner was not an outcast in most ancient societies. He was a civil servant. He had a job title. He had a family. He went home at the end of the day. The Romans called it pena. The Greeks called it timoria, the idea that punishment restores a kind of cosmic balance that wrongdoing has disturbed. The Persians, the Assyrians, the Mongols, the courts of medieval Europe, the imperial dynasties of China, they all had their own language for it, their own philosophy behind it. But they all agreed on the essential principle. Make it visible. Make it slow enough to be witnessed. Make it impossible to look away from. And make sure that every person watching understands exactly what they are seeing and exactly what it means for them. But here is what the textbooks almost never tell you. The detail that stays with you long after the names and the dates and the specific methods have faded from your memory. It is not the cruelty itself that haunts you when you look closely at this history. It is how ordinary everything around it was. The children sitting on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view. The merchants who kept selling figs from their carts. The pigeons that did not leave the rooftop. Life did not stop for what was happening in the square. It never did. And that tells you more about human nature than any of the methods ever could. You are on water now. Not swimming. Not floating free. You are sealed between two hollowed-out wooden boats, one above you and one below, with your head, your hands, and your feet left exposed to open air. The wood presses you from both sides. You cannot turn. You cannot shift. The sun is directly overhead and the water around you is not moving. Around 400 BC, the Persian Empire used a method of execution that the Greeks recorded in careful, almost clinical detail. They called it Scaphism, from the Greek word for boat. The Greek historian Plutarch described it without horror, with the same tone he used to describe a military maneuver, which is essentially what it was. The condemned was force-fed a mixture of milk and honey until the body could no longer absorb it. Then the same mixture was poured over every exposed surface of the body, face, hands, feet. Then the boats were pushed out onto a still, shallow pond and left there. In the full heat of the Persian sun. The insects came within hours. By the second day, the body's warmth and waste and the honey had created conditions that nothing living could resist. Flies. Then larvae. Working from the outside in, and then, when the body itself created the necessary conditions, from the inside out as well. The condemned did not die in a day. This was not the point. The body, left to its own extraordinary stubbornness, kept living, kept fighting. The Persians understood this and they planned for it. They returned each morning to force-feed the condemned again, more milk, more honey, to make sure the body retained the strength to continue experiencing what was being done to it. The most documented case is a man named Mithridates, a Persian soldier who had killed a prince. He lasted 17 days. Plutarch records this without editorial comment, the way you might record a weather event. 17 days. Hold that number for a moment. Because the thing that makes Scaphism so psychologically unbearable is not any single detail. It is the arithmetic of it. It is the knowledge from the very first hour that time is not on your side. That there is no version of this that ends well, and there is no version of this that ends quickly. The Persians did not invent cruelty, but they understood something about time that most executioners before them had not fully grasped. Prolonged suffering witnessed over days told a far more powerful story than an execution that was over in an afternoon. One death that lasted 17 days was worth more to the Persian court than 100 deaths that lasted a minute. That is not sadism. That is strategy. And that distinction is the most disturbing thing about it. If Persia understood leverage, Rome understood scale. After the slave revolt led by Spartacus collapsed in 71 BC, the Roman general Marcus Crassus made a decision that every Roman citizen traveling south from the city would remember for the rest of their lives. He had 6,000 men crucified along the Appian Way, the main road stretching from Rome toward the south of Italy. 6,000 crosses. 350 miles of road. You would travel for days and they would never stop appearing on either side of you. You would smell them before you saw them as you rounded each bend in the road. And long after the bodies had gone, after the birds and the weather and time had done their work, the crosses remained. Deliberately. Because the crosses were not the punishment. The crosses were the message. But crucifixion, for all its horror, was not Rome's most psychologically sophisticated tool. That distinction belongs to something far quieter. Something that happened not to enemies of Rome, but to Romans themselves. It was called decimation. Decimation was reserved for Roman soldiers who had shown cowardice or disobedience in battle. The procedure was precise and bureaucratic. The disgraced unit would be divided into groups of 10. Within each group, lots would be drawn. 1 man in 10, chosen by pure chance, regardless of what he had personally done or not done, would be beaten to death by the other 9. By his tentmates. By the men he had marched beside and eaten beside and survived with for years. The one who died might have been the bravest man in the unit. It did not matter. The lottery did not ask about bravery. It asked only for a number. Think about what that does, not to the man who dies, but to the 9 who survive. They now carry something that does not have a clean name. They are alive because a number was not theirs. They killed a man they knew and probably respected and possibly loved, because the alternative was dying themselves. And next time there is a decimation, next time the lots are drawn, the number might fall differently. Rome did not just punish soldiers with decimation. It rewired them. It replaced whatever loyalty and camaraderie they had built with something rawer and more useful. The cold understanding that survival is always conditional, always mathematical, always dependent on a draw they cannot control. An army of men who understand that is an army that does not disobey orders twice. In the 6th century BC, a Sicilian craftsman named Perillos went to the tyrant of Agrigento, a man named Phalaris, and presented him with a gift. It was a hollow bronze statue in the shape of a bull, life-sized, cast with extraordinary skill. The craftsmanship was exceptional. Phalaris admired it. And then Perillos explained the mechanism. There was a door on the side of the bull that opened. A condemned person would be placed inside. The door would be sealed. A fire would be lit beneath the bronze. And as the metal slowly heated, the person inside would, the designer explained with apparent pride, produce sounds that, filtered through a system of tubes and pipes built into the bull's head, would emerge from the nostrils and mouth as something resembling the bellowing of an actual animal. The suffering of the person inside would become, to the crowd outside, theater. Entertainment. Their screams, mechanically transformed, would become something almost beautiful. Phalaris, according to the historian Diodorus, was so revolted by the suggestion that he had Perillos himself placed inside the bull first, as a demonstration, and as a punishment for conceiving of such a thing. Perillos was removed before he died and then thrown from a cliff, because Phalaris apparently did not want the bull's first use to be tainted by its inventor. He then used the bull extensively for years. There is something in this story that sits differently from the others. The Persians and the Romans built their methods around utility, around what suffering could accomplish strategically. The brazen bull was different. It was designed with aesthetics in mind. It was designed to transform anguish into something pleasing to witness. And Phalaris, who was apparently disgusted enough by this to punish its creator, used it anyway. Because once a tool exists, and once you are the kind of person who holds power over others, the question of whether to use it has a way of answering itself. This is one of the oldest patterns in the history of power. The instrument gets built. The justification comes later. The medieval period is often imagined as a long, dim corridor, a passage between the organized cruelty of Rome and the more refined cruelty of later centuries. But medieval Europe did not stumble through its punishments blindly. It worked with procedure, with theology, with conviction. The Inquisition, both in its earlier papal form and in its more famous Spanish incarnation, was not a mob. It was a legal institution. It had courts and transcripts and formal charges and, in many cases, genuine appeals processes. The men who presided over it believed, with complete sincerity, that the pain they were authorizing for a body was a mercy extended to a soul. that a confession extracted under any condition was better than no confession at all. That saving someone from heresy, even against their will, even at the cost of everything their body could endure, was the highest possible act of love. The instruments they used had names and purposes and specifications. The strappado, wrists bound behind the back, the body hoisted by a rope until the shoulders dislocated, then dropped. The rack, the body stretched at both ends simultaneously, joints separating in sequence. The brodikins, boards pressed against the legs and tightened by wedges driven between them, progressively, until the bones gave way. Each of these had a protocol, a sequence, a point at which the procedure was to be paused to give the accused an opportunity to speak. It was organized. It was documented. The records survive. And here is the thing that the records reveal that no general description of the Inquisition ever quite captures. The men who ran it were not, by the standards of their time and by their own self-understanding, cruel men. Tomás de Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor of Spain, responsible for overseeing thousands of trials, was described by contemporaries as personally austere, devout beyond what his position required. He slept on a board rather than a bed. He denied himself food and comfort as a form of penance. He was, in his private life, gentle. He was performing, in his professional life, what he understood to be justice in service of God. The distance between those two things, the gentleness and the authorization of the brodikins, is not a medieval distance. It is a human distance. It exists in every century, including this one. In Imperial China, between approximately the 900s and the year 1905, the state reserved its most formal and elaborate response for the most serious offenses: treason, parricide, the killing of a master or a superior. The punishment was called Lingchi. In English it has been translated as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts. Both translations are technically accurate and emotionally entirely inadequate. Lingchi was not simply an extended execution. It was a ritual disassembly of a person, carried out according to a prescribed sequence, in public, before a crowd that was expected to witness the entire procedure. The philosophy behind it was rooted in beliefs about the nature of the body and its relationship to identity and to the afterlife. To die whole was to die in a way that preserved something essential. To be taken apart, piece by piece, deliberately and publicly, was understood not merely as killing a person but as performing a kind of annihilation, an erasure that extended past the moment of death itself. It was recorded. It was regulated. There were magistrates who oversaw it and documents that authorized each specific case. The last officially recorded execution by Lingchi in China took place in 1905. Photographs from that final period survive in archives in Europe and China. They have been studied by historians. They have been studied by philosophers. The French philosopher Georges Bataille spent years examining a single photograph from this period and wrote at length about what it provoked in him, and more specifically, about his discomfort at his own reaction to it. About the questions it forced him to ask about the relationship between suffering and what he called the sacred. About what it means to look at an image of extreme human suffering and find that looking produces not only horror but something else, something he could not name cleanly, something that made him distrust himself. That is the final trap this history sets for you. You have been watching all of this from a distance, from centuries of distance, from the comfortable remove of knowing it is over, knowing you are on the right side of it chronologically, knowing you would never have been one of the faces in the crowd. And then you keep reading. And you keep looking. And somewhere in the looking, without quite noticing the moment it happened, you are no longer certain that the distance is as large as you thought it was. That uncertainty is not comfortable. But it is, perhaps, the most honest thing this history has to offer. There is something that every list of historical punishments eventually leaves out. It leaves out the people. Not the famous ones, not Spartacus or Mithridates or the named heretics whose trials generated enough paperwork to survive into modern archives. It leaves out the ones whose names were never written down because they were never considered important enough to record. The ones for whom the punishment was not even a political statement, just an administrative fact. A line item. A case closed. A peasant in 12th century France accused of stealing grain. A woman in 15th century Castile whose neighbor decided she was practicing something she was not. A soldier in the Han dynasty who fell asleep at his post on the wrong night, when the wrong officer was walking the perimeter. A child in ancient Assyria who witnessed something he was not supposed to witness and could not be trusted to remain silent about it. These are the people the history of punishment is actually about. Not the emperors who ordered it. Not the philosophers who documented it. Not even the executioners who carried it out. The The people who ended up in the square without quite understanding how they got there. Who stood in the sun with their hands bound while someone nearby sold bread. Who looked out at the crowd and saw nothing they could appeal to. History records their deaths. It does not record their names. That erasure, the removal of a name, the reduction of a life to a category and a punishment, is perhaps the oldest and most fundamental act of cruelty in this entire story. Everything else is just the method. You are back in the square. The ropes are gone. The crowd is gone. Whatever happened here has long since been absorbed by the stone and the soil. There is probably something else on this ground now, a market, a cafe, a monument to something more comfortable to commemorate. Or maybe just ordinary life, going on the way ordinary life always goes on, right alongside the places where extraordinary things were done to ordinary people, without ever quite acknowledging the ground it is standing on. The history of brutal punishment is not a history of monsters. That framing is too easy, too clean, too useful to the part of us that needs to believe we are fundamentally different from the people who built these systems and maintained them and watched them operate without feeling the need to look away. It is not a history of monsters. It is a history of permissions. The permission given by emperors to generals, by generals to soldiers, by soldiers to themselves. The permission given by courts to inquisitors, by theology to courts, by fear to theology. The permission given, silently, by crowds who came to watch and by the far larger number of people who stayed home and decided it was not their concern. Cruelty does not erupt. That is the lesson. It does not arrive suddenly from outside the normal order of things, breaking through the surface of civilization in a moment of madness or failure. Cruelty is maintained. It requires maintenance. It requires clerks and administrators and specialists and judges and witnesses. It requires people who go home afterward and sleep well because they have decided that what they participated in today was necessary, or inevitable, or justified by something larger than the individual person it was applied to, or simply, and this is the most common justification of all, simply not their responsibility. The square is still there. Different city. Different justification. Different instruments, softer or more hidden, or perhaps more sophisticated in the particular distance they create between the decision and its consequences. But the structure is the same. It has always been the same. The only thing this history ever really asks you, the only question it keeps returning to, in every era, in every empire, in every square, is a simple one. What are you doing with what you see?